Hey everyone, this is a direct and honest conversation with Chris Kavanagh, the co-host of the podcast Decoding the Gurus. This is a show that looks at some of the new breed of public intellectuals, including some who've been featured on Rebel Wisdom. The hosts are both academics who specialise in religious thinking. Chris is a cognitive anthropologist and his co-host Matt Browne is a psychologist, and together they analyse the methods and messages of what they've described as secular gurus.
You always had individuals who would fulfill the role of kind of gurus or sense makers, or however you want to characterize them, in every age and whatever the technology that's available at the time. The modern era, and particularly with the growth of social media and the internet, I think the main change it made was that it made it possible to reach very large audiences with very little barriers to entry. And the technology that has grown up as the internet has matured has enabled that in all sorts of interesting and potentially beneficial, potentially harmful ways.
I think this conversation with Chris is important. It's about the necessity of criticism, where it goes too far, what counts as good faith and bad faith, and how truth-seeking gets corrupted. Alongside this interview, I've written a long piece for our Substack newsletter, which goes into much more depth with context, criticism, and some of his responses. The link is in the show notes below, so maybe stop this video or podcast now and go and read it for more background and sign up for our Substack while you're there. Welcome back. One of the main topics on Rebel Wisdom is that we're in post-secular times, and that we're seeing new religious phenomenon in politics and elsewhere. So Chris and Matt's work is really useful, especially as they've spent time developing a framework and criteria for what makes a secular guru, what they call the gurometer. It has 10 categories, including galaxy brainness.
So the first feature we refer to as galaxy brainness, and it's a bit flippant, but it's, kind of conceptualized well by that popular meme of the guy with the head exploding and with the cosmos inside it. And what we mean by galaxy brainness is this tendency for people not to have a specific area of expertise that they stay focused on, but rather that they offer takes across a whole cosmology of topics. There's almost nothing that they will refuse to offer opinions on, and when they do so, they tend to not do it with epistemic humility, right? So they might have a core expertise, say they're familiar with evolutionary biology, but they will then argue that because of the familiarity with evolutionary biology, that they can work from first principles to apply that technical insight to a huge array of topics, maybe anything related to human social interaction, right? Which essentially makes you capable of opining on any topic that relates to humans.
Cultishness.
You can think about this as encompassing the broad range of negative manipulation and social control techniques that you probably associate with cults and traditional gurus, but it also, we use it to refer to this tendency to create very strong binary in-groups and out-groups, particularly where the in-group is a kind of select group of people who are able to see beyond mainstream narratives or are able to approach things intellectually rigorously, whereas the outside group are those who are to be treated, disdainfully, looked upon with suspicion, and obviously critics are lumped into that category. In some respects, there's this willingness to acknowledge that there may be valid criticism of the positions that they want to advocate, but they will often say that they've never encountered it, that they've never encountered legitimate good faith criticism. So there's a hypothetical category of high quality good faith criticism, but unfortunately the only thing that the gurus tend to encounter is low quality, bad faith criticism. And that is not really worth their time.
And 8 others, which I've listed in the article. And you can also check out the recording of Chris introducing the project at the Stoa. And I've linked that in the show notes below as well. Now, it's a controversial project for many. And I have my own criticisms that I put to Chris in this conversation. You and a lot of those people around that sort of anti-IDW space have useful critiques, but there is something that comes in with critique that, and this is, that critique is sometimes used as almost like a lost leader for an attempt to destroy.
So one thing I completely would cop to and is that there is an element that are very critical of the IDW or sense-making sphere and are cruel, like not just snide, but cruel, I think, in the way that they approach it.
And it's also becoming more influential, even a guilty pleasure for many of the same public intellectuals that they look at. So if the right way to look at the landscape at the moment is being made up of different mimetic tribes battling with each other, and the solution is mediation, or at least understanding, as Peter Limberg argued in his Culture War 2.0 paper, again, I'll link it in the show notes below, then I think their podcast occupies a really important part of the information ecosystem, what we might call the critique sphere. We need good criticism, and I found Chris to be able to take what he dishes out most of the time. I'm also linking to a previous conversation that I had with Chris last summer, also in the show notes below, which was called Criticising the IDW, which you may find interesting to see how our perspectives have evolved since then. Here's a clip.
The issue that I detect with the response that you have received on multiple occasions when you raise criticism is that it suggests that claim about a willingness to engage in debate and deal with difficult conversations, which was core to the branding of the intellectual dark web. It didn't live up to that purpose. It doesn't live up to that standard now. And yet it is still framed by the members and by their supporters as if it does. And that to me is a really big issue. That, you know, there's lots of these kind of partisan communities or echo chambers or whatever way you want to view it. But by and large, maybe this is unfair, but I think that if you're listening to like Chapel Trapple Funhouse, you know the ecosystem that you belong to, and you're not in any illusion that it's, you know, a leftist dirtbag left or whatever sphere. But if you're a fan of the IDW, I get the impression from a lot of people that they feel they're beyond those kind of tribal partisanship, but that really doesn't seem to be the case. And that strikes me as like an issue that people need to grapple with and criticize.
And I hope you enjoy this conversation. Chris Kavanagh, welcome.
Thank you, David. Nice to see you again.
So you are one of the hosts of the Decoding the Gurus podcast. We're speaking because for a few different reasons. I've been aware of what you've been doing. We've been in touch kind of on Twitter and elsewhere for quite a while now. And I think that, so your podcast, I want to ask you a little bit about it in a second, kind of what it is, how it works, what you cover. But you are focused on criticizing or critiquing a lot of the same people that we featured on Rebel Wisdom over the last sort of 4 or 5 years. And you're definitely getting a lot more traction with the podcast. You recently had Sam Harris on. You also, I would say that you're getting particularly influential. I know your podcast is kind of a guilty pleasure for a lot of people who are in and around this space, whether you want to call it the heterodox or the intellectual dark web or wherever you want to draw the boundaries. I think that what you do has quite a lot of signal. I agree with a lot of the points that you make. I disagree about others. And in this conversation, I'd like to kind of surface some of those disagreements, talk a little bit about kind of what you're hoping to achieve from it. And yeah, let's maybe start with, if you want to kind of describe what the show is about.
Yeah, it's against my nature to be consistently earnest, but I'll try to restrain myself. And at least when I'm outlining the podcast, because I think our influence is somewhat overstated. But in any case, the podcast is hosted by myself and Matthew Browne, an Australian academic. He's a psychologist, and I'm a cognitive anthropologist slash psychologist. I teach in the psychology department, and in essence, the podcast is looking, well, initially it was around what we termed secular gurus, the kind of online figures, including people that you've featured like Jordan Peterson, but also Nassim Taleb or Sam Harris, or various people that have attracted followings online and are promoting kind of, can be philosophical systems or can be, ways of looking at the world, but that don't tend to fall into the traditional categories of like spiritual gurus or, disparagingly like cult leaders or that kind of thing. So we found this kind of new crop of online secular gurus to be an interesting phenomenon. And Matt and I shared an interest in conspiracy communities and anti-vax movements, and in my case, religion and ritual from a psychological perspective. So it was a kind of interesting set of characters, and we were noticing some characteristics that we thought were consistent across quite different people. So we, in the podcast, we set out to kind of look at their content and explore it critically. And the way the format of the podcast is that we take a piece of content or a couple of pieces of content, usually 2 or 3 episodes, released by someone, and then we analyze it. We take clips from it and kind of comment on looking at the way arguments are constructed, or what we would note as rhetorical techniques or this kind of thing. So we're kind of applying what we would normally do in academia, I think, when looking at papers or when looking at arguments, but more applying that standard to the output of the kind of online sphere and these secular gurus. Although we've covered people that fall outside that original remit, so our scope has kind of broadened from the initial motivation. But so that's we primarily are trying to produce something that we enjoy making, because we like commenting and looking critically at things, but also hopefully giving people some tools and some ideas about how to look critically at the content that they're consuming, or that is just out there, on the interwebs.
Interested firstly about what it is about the internet that creates these kind of dynamics, because there does seem to be something about the nature of social media. It's kind of even baked into the language, the idea that you have followers on Twitter, and the ability to kind of create echo chambers by blocking people, or by kind of, it sort of almost naturally gets created. What do you think it is about? Do you think it's tied into social media that these kind of behavior dynamics are now prevalent?
Yeah, so I think they always existed, and you always had individuals who would fulfill the role of kind of gurus or sense makers, or however you want to characterize them, in every age, and whatever the technology that's available at the time, that's what people will use to get their message out, whether it's nailing a thesis to the front of a church, or banging stuff off on the printing press, or sending out tweets. But I think while there is this kind of long-standing connection across like the ages, just through the nature of the way humans are, the modern era, and particularly with the growth of social media and the internet, I think the main change it made was that it made it possible to reach very large audiences with very little barriers to entry, and that people, as you say, are able to kind of attract and keep followers. And the technology that has grown up as the internet has matured has enabled that in all sorts of interesting and potentially beneficial, potentially harmful ways, with, you know, Reddit allowing like little specific communities focused around topics, and Discords where people can form communities, again, focused around topics or personalities. Patreon creating kind of walled communities or locals. And so I think that a lot of the technologies, and including, you know, Facebook and Twitter as well, but like that these enable the creation of communities that previously would only have existed in the forms of communes or things which required much more like physical commitment. And now you don't need that. You just need an interest and an internet connection. So I think that's brought people into connection with a lot of people that are, you know, potentially offering messages and worldviews that that can be appealing. So yeah, I definitely think the digital ecosystem, it's at least made it a lot less difficult for people to develop followings and to join communities, for better and worse.
If you wanted to kind of say that the ultimate echo chamber is a cult, basically, you kind of realize that effectively that's kind of what happens, I think, when human nature plays out through the internet. You kind of create these kind of little world views. My perspective is a little bit more broad. I think that this is a sort of natural warping effect of the internet. I think you're probably right that some people are better or worse at kind of fomenting those kind of dynamics, but I think we all get caught in those. I think we actually have to kind of be aware and be conscious that we're all going to get dragged into those kind of dynamics one way or another, just because none of us like taking criticism. None of us like really kind of being exposed, being questioned. And we have confirmation bias. We have all of these kind of biases built into us. So I kind of feel like it's a level playing field to some degree.
Yeah, I think there's a podcast and a book associated with it. There's a writer called Amanda Montell who is writing about the kind of linguistics of cults, and she talks about cultishness, right? And her podcast is quite interesting because she tends to look at a bunch of things that don't tend to be treated as traditional cults, right? Like looking at kind of fitness communities, or like fans of, you know, Korean pop music or so on. And I think the interesting thing is, one, that she puts these things on a spectrum and says, you know, everyone to some extent is, you know, has, every group that you belong to has like some element of cultish dynamics to a certain extent. And I think that's the same when it comes to, you know, guru tendencies or any particular pathological tendency that people might have, or cognitive biases, which, you know, need not be pathological. But I think in saying that there still is a useful thing. One is to recognize that there's always a spectrum of activities and that you're on those spectrums with everyone else, but also that there really are outliers. There are people who are not like you and me or many of the people listening to this. And it's often hard for people to model the mental logic of people who are very different from them. And I think that some of the people that we cover on our podcast, not all of them, but some of them really are very different from ordinary people. And the things that drive them and the dynamics that they instill in their audience are things that normally people wouldn't encourage, or, you know, they wouldn't seek out. So I think it's definitely good not to like imagine that you are immune from all of the biases or group dynamics that you might criticize. But it is okay to say some people like lean into those dynamics in a way that others wouldn't, and the gurus do it like to often an extreme extent. At least the people we cover.
Yeah, but I also wonder how much of that is a kind of feedback loop of some latent kind of characteristic that then, under the pressure of something like audience capture or late life fame or any of these kind of other dynamics that you get online, then sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, I do think that things can become more extreme, and maybe kind of latent personality characteristics that weren't fully realized can get worse. And we've seen that with people. Let's just take James Lindsay as an example. Like, he's certainly not the same person now that he was 2 years ago or 4 years ago, even though you can probably look back and think, yeah, you can kind of see some of the telltale signs. So I do think that there's a kind of feedback loop that gets activated with a lot of these people. I mean, I just want to say, yeah.
Sorry, I only wanted to interject in the case of the James that, I don't want to distance diagnose him. Like, I think his personality disorders are available for any user of Twitter to see each day. But I do think that when, like you said, if you interacted with James Lindsay a number of years ago, for example, his politics were quite different and his reach was substantially less than what it is now. But there's an interview, and I would encourage anybody that wants to, check my assessment, listen to his interview with the Very Bad Wizards, the two academics that have a podcast. They interviewed him back in the original, when he had the conceptual penis paper, kind of mocking, the like feminist, the postmodern scholarship, and they were generally critical of postmodern approaches, but they raised some very valid critical points with that particular endeavor, like the main one being that it was published in a pay-to-play journal, which you just pay money and they publish. So it doesn't really prove what he wanted to set out. But his reaction to the criticism was very, like, it was not what you would normally expect. And it came across as very sensitive, very thin-skinned, and narcissistic, to be quite plain about it. And I think what you are saying about, the feedback mechanisms, if you have a kind of narcissistic personality and you go on to a social media account which based around driving content, getting followers, and, being cheered on, it's like a honey trap for you. But that personality feature is, everybody has a bit of a narcissist inside of them, but not everyone is Donald Trump. And James Lindsay has gone, he was picking fights with the Holocaust Memorial site. That's not a normal person. Most people wouldn't do that. Even if their politics matched James Lindsay, they wouldn't do that. He would. And so it's a warning case, but I don't think most ordinary people would go there.
Yeah, and I want to steer directly into the one of the big questions here, because we're already kind of talking about named people with James Lindsay. And this is something we talked about. So we had a kind of informal conversation that we recorded in the summer. And one of the things I brought up then, and I still feel a certain level of discomfort around, is the nature of your podcast is that you're criticizing people not to their face. You have a dialogue with, you take their content, you take clips from their content. I've also taken something of a sort of journalistic attitude to a lot of these figures. I had a kind of slight run-in, or I questioned James Lindsay 3 or 4 years ago, and he responded really badly to that. I did something similar with Dave Rubin. I do still feel this level of discomfort about talking about someone in a way that can appear very gossipy to people. Like when what I've tried to do is to have the criticisms to someone's face. Like I had the interview with Dave Rubin, I had the interview with James Lindsay. You could argue that didn't go particularly well either. I would probably say that the only time that I've had a full-on challenging interview with someone that hasn't kind of where we've still been like really good friends afterwards has been with the trigonometry guys, with Konstantin and Francis. That they have, as far as I'm concerned, really do walk the walk in terms of you can ask us whatever you want, you can be as critical as you want, we'll deal with that. We had quite a kind of fiery Barney and came out, and I still respect them a lot. But I want to just raise that again, and I will actually direct people towards the unlisted video that we recorded in the summer, because I think it's a really good thing to go back to if people want to see how the landscape has changed since then. We talked about, for example, Brett. I had a different attitude to him back then than I subsequently did, and it's worth going back and looking at. I watched it back, and I was actually saying, I know that Brett will engage with critics, and that's why I respect him. And some things have changed. But I want to raise that, because there is a kind of, one of the criticisms of what you're doing is that it's a sort of ankle-bitery kind of, potentially kind of getting a name off criticizing others. It's not engaging them face to face. It's talking about them effectively behind their back. And that does, I don't quite know whether I agree with that criticism, but it's one that came up for me, and I think one that comes up a lot.
Yeah, and so there's a couple of things to say, and some I might be repeating, but I'll try to be more eloquent. That will be the improvement. So one of the points I would make in response to that is that the most straightforward response is that we invite anybody that we cover, should they so wish to take issue, they can come on and talk to us, or we can talk to them on, their podcast or whatever. Like, we'll happily put the criticisms to their face should they want it, right? And we made that just to be fair, and also but we were kind of aware, we didn't really expect that many people would take it up, right? Because especially if they don't like us, why would they do so? However, I do think that in many cases, the people that we criticize, their brand is that they're ready to get in there and have the hard conversations, and they'll respond, and it isn't about status and that kind of thing. So I think that it kind of contradicts that image that they present, that, and by and large, they won't engage with criticism, including people like Brett Weinstein. But in any case, I think that's a little bit of a useful thing that we have, right? So the more, I think, the more relevant response to it is that the content that we comment on is already out there and it's publicly available. And when people are sharing it and kind of praising it, people have no issue. So responding to it and offering criticism is not, it's definitely not done behind their back, because they can just download it and listen to it. And, they can respond or ignore it or do whatever they want. And the content already sits there. And in most cases, these are long form content where people have had hours and hours of indulgent conversation with people who agree with them. And it feels like, okay, taking a critical look at the content that people are promoting to large audiences is fair game. You don't get to have a long form podcast where it's kept private and nobody's allowed to, make criticism of it. So I see it in those terms. But the issue of ankle biting and gossiping and that kind of thing, I tend to think that, one, we try to focus on the content that the people are putting out and the rhetorical techniques and such on that are in that particular content. But I don't have this aversion that other people do, and I think it's something of a common pathology in the sense-making space, that people regard the personality and the broader context of somebody's work and output to be off limits if you're considering their arguments, right? There's a lot of people that want to say there's the ideas and then there's the person, and never the twain shall meet. And my response to that would be, why? Like, you can critique somebody's ideas, and you can also consider how their personal experience, how their broader worldview is influencing the ideas that they are advocating. And very rarely are the two completely independent. To give an example of what I mean, I think if you don't consider the personal histories of Brett and Eric Weinstein, their experiences with academia and their kind of narrative about what happened to them and how the institutions mistreated them, you don't properly understand their anti-institutional message and what it rests on. It rests rather firmly, in Brett's case, on his PhD experiences, in Eric's case, with his PhD experiences, and their belief that they found revolutionary theories that went unacknowledged by the academic institutions and that exist. And so I tend to think that the personality factors, which are often on display in the content that people promote, it shouldn't be off limits. And like, I'm not saying that you make fun of the way that people wear their hair or that kind of thing, but I am saying if you detect that somebody is self-aggrandizing and narcissistic in their content, that is a sign and something that you should note. It is not an ad hominem to note that Donald Trump is a narcissist and this skews how he presents things. So in the same way, I kind of think those things shouldn't be off limits. That would be at least some of the response that I would offer. And I guess the very last thing is, whether we want to increase our profile by going after like big fish in order to get their audience and that kind of thing. I'm not saying that Matt and I are immune to audience dynamics and feedback. Like, everybody online is to some extent susceptible to that. But primarily, Matt and I's identities are tied to being academic, and we, like everyone, we're trapped in the culture war and cannot escape it. But we tend to find, like, after we do a couple of episodes, which are like recently we did Joe Rogan and Robert Malone and Peter McCulloch, and we are quite content now to not talk about anti-vaxxers or the Rogan, guests for, the conceivable next while, as long as we can avoid it, because we'd rather, not become enmeshed in that kind of thing. So people who we criticize often view us as, that we're just targeted on taking down the Weinsteins or that kind of thing. But the reality is that we just find them like interesting examples of this guru template that we've documented, like in their case, almost a prototypical example. And our next episode will be on Robert Wright, who we like, and we've interviewed, the author of Why Buddhism is True. And after that, we're going to do Jerome Lanier, the kind of guy who says delete Facebook and that kind of thing. And nobody is asking us to look at that. Those, Jerome Lanier is not like a big figure in the culture war, but we find him interesting, and that's kind of what motivates us. But like, Rogan, Sam Harris, all these people, they're obviously big people that we should look at because everybody knows that they are examples of kind of online personalities with large followings. So So yeah, that was a very long answer, but I hope covered some useful ground.
Your podcast is kind of awkwardly poised between academia and media in a way. As I've kind of thought about it, there's a very different attitude towards critique and criticism in academia than maybe there is in the alternative media space, where there's a certain kind of awkwardness there. And I think partly you're very sarcastic as well. You've got kind of, you're sarcastic, which I can understand a little bit more, like as a fellow British Islesian. I can appreciate that. I can appreciate that sarcasm a little bit more. And I found generally in a lot of the work that I've done, like the Americans in particular do tend to take themselves a lot more seriously. But you want to say something about that kind of, because that's the other thing I kind of realize is that both you and Matt, you are actually academics in this space. It's not just simply that you've got a podcast that criticizes people. It's that this is something that you study, and you are coming from a tradition in academia with a slightly different attitude towards critique and criticism.
Yeah, that's fair. So I think the two things do lean into each other, the sarcastic personality and an appreciation for sarcasm and the academic aspects, but I would separate them out, and I would say that that my background, as my accent indicates, is from Northern Ireland, which has a kind of cultural emphasis on sarcasm and taking the piss, and that fits very neatly with Matt's personality and the part of Australia that he's from, which seems to do a similar thing. So we gel quite nicely just because of our personality type. And it is true to say that I think online, especially on Twitter and so on, that sometimes I may get in trouble because people don't read the tone of the comments that I'm making. They take them more seriously than I intended. That's one aspect, and I think something might rub some people the wrong way. The academic component is different, and that is really that, as you mentioned, Matt and I are both academics. We publish and we teach in universities, and academia has lots of problems, but the one thing that it does quite well is promote a culture of strong criticism and critique. And Matt has often referred to what the ideal of what we're doing on the paper or on the podcast is the same way that we would engage with, reviewing a paper or examining a kind of student's essay. That one might be like too negative or too dismissive, but it isn't treating the gurus as like a student, but rather the arguments that they're making in the same respect, like looking at them critically, the logic of them, and pointing out areas where we see weaknesses or reliance on rhetorical techniques. So in academia, when you submit papers or when you advocate a specific theoretical perspective, you often do get quite strong criticism or pushback and a kind of acid testing of ideas. Now, it's not that academics are then completely saintly and treat everything as an objective, a kind of objective discourse just about competing theoretical models. No, they don't. But the norm towards accepting criticism, responding to it, is very strongly instilled. So we do intend in the podcast to bring a little bit of the culture of academia to the guru space that we look at, and that means making strong criticisms, but we are not usually intending it to be deeply personal. Now, this is not to say, because of the first component, the sarcastic aspect, and the fact that we're making a podcast and not doing something academic, we do have fun, and we are, sometimes flippant and sometimes quite harsh in our comments, but that's the nature of doing, a podcast as opposed to writing an academic article about the topic. We are in the process of doing the latter, and then our tone will be different. But on a podcast, and especially in this space, I think it is also important to puncture the kind of air of self-importance that floats around a lot of the gurus, and to be willing to address the aspects of personality and that, I mentioned when we're talking about the Grometer, a lot of the issues with the kind of worldview that secular gurus offer is tied into their own origin stories, is tied into their own self-aggrandizement and revolutionary theories and so on. So ignoring the personality factors or the kind of contextual details, I think does a disservice, because these are not people who are just out there, kind of presenting their ideas and then fading into the background. It is a lot about personality and the way that they present themselves and their ideas as well. So that's why we look at those aspects, delivery, and rhetorical techniques and so on.
I mean, I agree with you that there is often a kind of defense strategy in a lot of these areas, especially the sort of the wider aligned IDW space that sort of rules offline. And I think in a quite tactical way, the sort of like ad hominem arguments, I think it's more of a defense strategy than it is a genuine objection a lot of the time.
And it's a double standard.
And it's a double standard because they're willing to do that to others on a regular basis. Yeah, but also because I do think we do need to bring in that sort of psychological dimension. And I would use the example of someone like Robert Malone. You just mentioned him, like not acknowledging that Robert Malone feels deeply wounded by the fact that he feels written out of the history of the vaccines, I think is you're missing the key driving force of what is motivating him to make a lot of the claims that he's making. And I think that without bringing that in, like for me, and I know how much you love the term sense making, so I'll use it as much as possible. Because for me, sense making brings in those dimensions. Like I think the way that we've used that term on Rebel Wisdom and has been about trying to incorporate that. We talk about Jungian psychology. We talk about the integration of the shadow, looking at what triggers you in others is probably a sign of something that you need to work on in yourself. And I don't think you can do that kind of analysis or understand the world without doing that kind of introspection. And so I do think that it's dangerous territory because it can drift into ad hominem very quickly. And what I fear that you can do sometimes is there can be an energy of dismissing someone, or I feel sometimes from you an energy of dismissing someone in total when you kind of criticize their motivation. Whereas for me, that's another piece of information. Like they can still be right about a lot of things, wrong about others. Knowing that motivation, knowing their blind spots, I think helps me kind of calibrate. I do, in some of our conversations, I do feel like, I don't want to kind of bring up any particular names, but you kind of...
I don't mind.
Well, let's say you covered my conversation with Jordan Hall. Like Jordan Hall, I think is a perfect example. That my sense is that I get this kind of feeling of like a kind of energetic dismissal of him in total, whereas for me, Jordan is a complex character who I find fascinating, found really interesting that he was willing to kind of steer into the discomfort and come on and talk about a conversation he had with Brandon Hayes, this sort of fascist proprietarian guy that I criticized, and was willing to have that conversation. And I find a lot of his theories fascinating about, and really worthwhile, and a lot of people do, about the kind of the complex dynamics of innovation and change. And like the piece that he wrote after the Trump election in 2017, I think was hugely influential for really good reasons. And sometimes when I speak to you, I get the sense of you kind of like, I don't like him for this reason, I'm going to kind of, write him off.
Yeah. So, it might be difficult without, like, I can understand why. Yeah. No. I mean, just, I don't want to make you have to speak about Jordan, but allow me to. So in the case, I think you're definitely right that like we have differing standards of like or assessments, I think, of people. But I would disagree with the view that it's my approach is that, okay, so this guy made a mistake or is kind of conspiratorial about that, and therefore he can't be right about anything else. That's not my issue with people like Jordan. It's because I completely agree with Sam Harris and various other people when they say, like, your worst enemy can make good points, right? That meme exists for a reason, right? The worst person just made a great point. And Alex Jones can say things that are right. So can Hitler. They can be right about things and still be terrible people. Now, I'm not saying Jordan Hall is Hitler, but what I would say is that I see with Jordan and similar figures a massive signal to like noise to signal ratio in favor of noise, and that what I detect and what we were critical of in the podcast where we covered him was this kind of, the unkind word for it would be sort of profound bullshit, right? It's a technical term in psychology. It does exist. I'm not, but Deepak Chopra and various other people are very good at this, at kind of making things sound profound and deep and difficult. But the actual point they're making tends to be fairly mundane, and if not to be like mesmerizing with technical jargon. I think Jordan is definitely guilty of that, and I would encourage anybody that was interested to check our podcast. I know they will have listened to him here if they're from your audience, but I also would say on that so my heuristic is that when I notice people making bad assessments and engaging in what I regard as like wanton use of rhetorical techniques, I assume that is not limited to one specific area, that they didn't just decide to become like extremely rhetorical for this one area and to make use of pseudo profound bullshit to talk about this one topic, and they won't do it for anything else. And 9 times out of 10, that is proven correct. And if we stick with the case with Jordan Hall, for example, I've seen him interacting with Brett, talking about Omicron and the way that it came out. And he very much indulges the kind of narrative that Brett or Jordan Peterson make about, well, this is a manufactured, fear of a virus and so on. And that fits very neatly with the assessment that I have based on your discussion with him with the proprietarians. Now, it doesn't mean I think he can never say anything interesting or useful about technology, but I would be extremely wary about pointing an audience to him or people like him and saying, this is a good person who you should, orientate towards and assign a lot of credibility to. So I'm much harsher with like people like Eric Weinstein and so on than you are, but as a result, I'm often not very surprised when when Brett took the turn that he did. It was not a huge surprise to me. It kind of fell in line with the heuristics that we observed. Same with James Lindsay and so on. And it can be quite what's that word? Like a cynical worldview to have. But unfortunately, cynicism seems to often be right. So I find the sense-making community if my biggest criticism of it is that it's too credulous to people who can take advantage of that. And I would encourage like more skepticism. And I don't think that's limited to the sense-making community, but I think that's an issue. And it's the same issue I wanted to like raise with Sam Harris when we discussed with him, is when you have all these figures that are in your orbit, that are in your social network, and so many of them fall into conspiracism and right-wing partisanship. For was me, it would give me pause. Why is that pattern happening? Why didn't I notice those people might have had that tendency? And you can say, well, you know, nobody knew COVID, it's a new situation. But the thing is, lots of people have noticed that in advance and have kind of flagged it up that this person seems conspiratorially minded. And I don't think Sam Harris or sense makers grapple enough with, you know, how many of the characters in the orbit turn out to be like concerning in their trajectory.
Yeah, and as you know, my main focus is like, where is the heterodox right? And my main concern is that there are very few places that I see where there is a genuine dialogue across any divisions at all, in a way, in this kind of very fragmented ecosystem. But in particular, like the place where you've staked out your podcast, and I see you as, there's a whole sort of group of 2 online academics that sort of have kind of coalesced around a kind of opposition to the IDW. And I would say that you are among those. The Decoding the Gurus came out of that kind of ecosystem. And I think it's a really important ecosystem. I think it's in the same way that the birth of the IDW with Barry Weiss's article in 2018 was sort of the naming of a nascent thing that clearly had some coherence because the name stuck and it became this big cultural force. And I think by definition, you create something that becomes a kind of new thesis, you create a new antithesis. And I do think that you and a lot of those people around that sort of anti-IDW space have useful critiques, but there is something that comes in with critique that, and this is, that critique is sometimes used as almost like a loss leader for an attempt to destroy, an attempt to, and so a lot of the critique can be hard to take because it comes with an energy of, and I would use the word snide, like the word snide kind of sums up, and I don't think you often go there. I see why other people see you in that way. I see why other people perceive that in the way you operate. I think you sometimes overstep the mark a little bit on Twitter, but generally speaking, I don't get that sense, whereas I do from obviously like the dirtbag left and the whole kind of Majority Report kind of energy was really fueled primarily by that. But I wouldn't say that that's the case. But I do worry that that's the nature of like that snideness, that kind of desire to tear down, which I think, and it's like the good faith, bad faith thing. Good faith is sort of, it's situational. We all have the tendency, or all have the potential to be good faith or bad faith, depending on the situation, the context that we're in. And while, like I say, I don't think that you do that often, but I do think that you do have the potential to do it. And I also think that just the nature of what I worry about is the same audience dynamics are playing out with you and your podcast as they're playing out with a lot of the people that you're covering. And it pulls you apart. It pulls you into a more polarized space. Firstly, how would you avoid that? What are the sort of checks and balances on that for you? How do you, knowing that that's just the natural state of things, that you will be pulled in that direction, how do you avoid that happening?
Yeah, there's really a lot of like very interesting points there. And like, so one thing I completely would cop to and is that, there is an element that are very critical of the IDW or sense-making sphere and are cruel, like not just snide, but cruel, I think, in the way that they approach it. And they would see it as a moralistic thing that they're, that they are kind of taking down pompous windbags, right? And they're on the side of good, the side of science, whatever way you want to take it. And I would completely agree that, like, one, I don't like that. I have to say, I sometimes I can find things funny, as the way like everybody can when, somebody makes a kind of cutting, like sarcastic takedown of someone. But I genuinely don't like that kind of like personalized animosity, just by my character. It might not seem like it, but I genuinely don't. And
I will say as well, Chris, like I'm British.
Yeah.
You're from the British Isles. Like I recognize that there is a dividing line between sarcasm and snark that I'm not convinced that Americans are able to pass quite as well as I am when I read your stuff or listen to you. There is some snark sometimes, but yes. I think maybe there is a kind of lost in translation thing as well. So I'll just throw that in.
No, there definitely is. And like it's probably part of the reason that you're more tolerant of me than some of the other American people in the IDW sphere. Although a lot of them have turned around with the COVID thing. But in any case, I will say I'm not immune to that. I don't take shots at certain people because I don't want hassle. And even when I find their point annoying, I kind of like think, well, do I want to deal with their followers, right, for the next like couple of days? And I'm as guilty of that as and also that's like one set that happens, and I tend to not have that feeling when it's with someone I don't like, right? Because I don't really mind if I annoy their followers or whatever. Like people that are far enough off your outgroup cannot really harm you by, being like James Lindsay sending his people to attack me. Might be annoying, but I don't really care, right? And people that are like slightly closer to you, even if they're not on your in-group, they your specific branch of the left or wherever it is, they can have a bigger impact. And like I would be more wary of my critiques for that reason, and like throat clearing right before you endorse certain people's perspectives. Like I do that, and everybody does it online to some extent. Some people are braver than others in that regard. And I think in that respect, like one is that group of people, another is there are people I like who, I get on with well, who I think are more politically partisan than me. And if I was reacting without the interpersonal dynamic, I'd be more critical of what they were saying or some of the points that they want to make. But so that plays a part. Like I'm not saying, and I don't think that you should factor that out, when you're looking at how people interact with other people online. Like the interpersonal part and those kind of in-group, out-group dynamics always play a role. But you were talking more about the audience incentives and like being pulled by audience, and as your audience grows, that's like
you mentioned that some people can be quite cruel and can be like the real sort of hardcore anti IDW figures, and some of them are in your audience. Some of them are following.
Yeah. Definitely. And I think like, so part of it is that I think you definitely notice how parts of your audience are reacting. And like, if you notice that there's a contingent which doesn't fit with your values, right, which like Sam Harris famously recognizes quite often, you can do things that then will indicate your values and where they might diverge from the other people's values. And we have certainly had people that have had that experience. And Matt and I, like, we didn't get into the podcast thinking about that, but it is something that we think about, and that all the podcasters that we've talked to, especially the people that we would consider like within the very similar sphere to us. So you talked about, the kind of anti-IDW left, academic left, but I think Very Bad Wizards, that kind of two psychologists, four beers, which are touched on the culture war and tend to do it critically, but I wouldn't say they're like defined by their anti-IDW stance. And those are really more of our like in-group. And I know that they consider their audience dynamics, right? When they see people thinking, oh, and so in that case, we do think out, okay, we're going to talk about this topic this week and this one, and what are we going to do for the next, like month? And that's an editorial thing where Matt and I want our choices to reflect our values and also respond to if people are getting the wrong impression, right, about like what our endeavor is about, and there is a very common misconception, and I completely understand why it exists, that our podcast is simply to take down people we don't like, and we want to cover more people who are people we like or people we find interesting, to show that, like, no, the rhetorical tools, yes, they're misused a lot by nefarious characters or characters that have inflated egos, at least, but actually these kind of rhetorical techniques and arguments that are conspiratorial in nature can come from people that are good, or that you might strong overall agree with, but everybody, including us, is guilty of using rhetoric to some extent. And I think that leaning into that to like sometimes go against expectations, or what will lead to more engagement and more growth. Like if we wanted to, what we could be is simply a podcast that like slammed IDW figures every single week, right? And just took Ruben and all of the like the main people and like went really hard on making fun of them, and we get a response. Our audience would be bigger. I suspect it would grow faster, but we'd hate that, and that's not what we want to do. So I'm not saying we're never guilty of making fun of people, or like we quite clearly do enjoy, like but I think in general it's mostly done in like good humor, like the intention is good humor, at least. But yeah, so I think one thing is that editorial choices that you make to try and avoid, like to disappoint segments of your audience that you think need to be disappointed. And like, to give a very recent example, we recorded a conversation just a couple of days ago with Virginia Heffernan, and it was a very enjoyable conversation, like a back and forth, but she's much more skeptical about the kind of value of population genetics or IQ as a construct, as a construct that's of any use within the psychology discipline, and we are not, right? So we have that discussion, and we try to make our perspective like on those topics clear, and I think we did. And as a result, it'll be interesting to see how people react to different things. But we have had people who have listened to episodes and said, you shouldn't put in Ibram X. Kendi in the same category as Jordan Peterson. Is like, what are you doing? What's your agenda? And like that's mistaking what the podcast is about, or what we mean when we talk about gurus, because there are left-wing gurus, and they're it's perfectly legitimate to cover them, and like we want to cover them. So yeah, that's like, I don't know if that answers all of that, but I think being aware of audience dynamics and being willing to kind of push back against them, and aware of when, like, I think part of it is because me and Matt are co-hosts, we can talk through how we are, finding things, or like, and we can kind of pull up about what we are worried about, or, do you think this is going too far down this line? And like, yeah, it helps to have two people making those decisions and talking things through, I think, as well.
Because I mean, the thing that comes to mind is the Who Watches the Watchmen.
Oh yeah. Well,
I mean, because I mean, there's a few things here. One of which is you're setting yourself, because you're sort of setting yourself up. And I've seen this criticism of you as well. It's kind of like hall monitor vibes.
Mm-hmm.
And I get this feeling. I do honestly, like when I see that you've tweeted me on Twitter, I kind of get this like there's a kind of siren goes off. It's like, oh, the police are here, and I'm kind of gonna check what Chris is making of it.
Well,
because firstly, you've set yourself up as you kind of had to set yourself up in a position that I think is kind of vulnerable. The sort of hall monitor vibes that people talk about. You have to be kind of, I would argue that you have to be particularly squeaky clean because of that. Like, what would a kind of Decoding the Gurus podcast look like? And would you welcome it?
So, yeah, like the first thing is like it's kind of the title of the podcast just invited that we would, get asked, well, who will decode you? Or, right. And I think we'll always now, our curse is that we will forever hear that like in emails and in feedback. And I don't blame people because it's like a very, obvious thing to say, but we've now heard it like a million times. And in each case, like we've even discussed like, okay, so if we got other people on to decode an episode of us talking, like who would we get on that would be like appropriately roasting and critical, and so I think we will do that. Like it's very meta, but we'll probably will do it in the future, and it'll be uncomfortable. But it also, like you say, you have to be able to take on what you dish out, and in the case of us being hall monitors or like policing the edges of acceptable discourse or this kind of thing, I don't think that's what we're setting out to do. Like we're looking critically at content, but some people mistake it as us saying that nobody else should engage with this content or that kind of thing. And very rarely do that. I say that. In general, I openly encourage people to go and look at the original content, and even people who completely disagree with our take, I kind of am more impressed when somebody could completely disagree and listen to the whole thing than somebody who completely agrees with everything we say. But I think that the something that, and this relates to audience size and this kind of thing. Like I'm still, there are large accounts on Twitter. I'm a 10K account. Like it's not nothing, but it's, it's relatively small. But I will say that I already have the experience now that like before, if I see Jordan Peterson talking to Joe Rogan in a tuxedo, it looks like a ridiculous scene, right? Like it is an on the face of a ridiculous image to see somebody in a tuxedo on a podcast, right? And I just wanted to comment on that ridiculousness, right? I wasn't making a pointed critique of the arguments or some deep philosophical point. I was just saying, well, that's odd, right? And that's all I wanted to say. But when I posted that, I inevitably get people responding saying, so this is what decoding looks like. And this is, oh, yeah, this is the level of critical. You just hate the man. And I'm like, all right, well, this is kind
of a little bit below the belt, that one.
Well, yeah, but like the thing is, it's okay. Like I was, I argued with someone in the comments, like if he showed up in assless chaps, right, to the podcast, might you make a comment? Would it be okay then? And it would be, right?
Peterson, that's intrinsic to his identity, is that it really matters what you wear, and he obviously was very keen to make a good impression with Rogan.
True, but that's the point, because like I actually always think, in general, that Jordan Peterson looks very dapper, like a kind of aristocratic time traveler look, and I've no issue with that, and I know his philosophy around dressing up and but he kind of went
dyeing his hair purple. He's really into dressing up and dyeing your hair purple, I think.
yeah, that's it. I'm marching and protesting, but he like it just what to me was like it was a funny scene, right? And it kind of like was going to the next level of like formality because it's almost wearing a tuxedo to a podcast, right? It's a kind of like funny, but I'm under no illusion that that's like a searing critique or it's a important point that the world needs to know. It was just something funny that I wanted to mention. But because my account has grown a bit and because of the podcast, I know that, you know, when I make that comment, it'll probably get more interaction because it's attacking an IDW person. And then I will have to deal with the comments of people saying, like, why do you hate the guy so much? And I just want to make, you know, like an offhand comment because I'm a sarcastic, annoying person. And like that, I feel is sort of my comeuppance for doing the podcast and stuff, that I now have to deal with that like when I make threads about people or I want to like offer my opinion on a podcast, right? Just in the same way, if I watched a movie, I might want to like say, you know, I watched Spider-Man, I thought it was good. I'm not saying therefore anyone that has a different opinion can go to hell. But when I like comment on a podcast and say, you know, Sam Harris said this and it really annoyed me or whatever, I tend to get a lot of feedback like, who are you to dare to judge Sam? And I'm like, I'm just someone that listened to the content and has an opinion on it, just like you. And like, I haven't gone to your feed and said, you know, don't dare to say something nice about Sam, or don't dare to, you know, find this enjoyable or unenjoyable. I'm all for people sharing their opinion, but it's kind of like, I do feel this kind of annoying, like a little thing that grates on me is like, I'm expressing an opinion and you people are supposed to be in favor of free speech and open debate and all this. And you wouldn't be taking an issue with me if I was expressing a positive opinion. So if I'm telling people they can't have any other opinion, then that's different. But I just tend to tell people that I think that like if you don't recognize Alex Jones as a conspiracy theory, you're an idiot, right? But I'm not saying therefore nobody can have that opinion. Go ahead, have the opinion. I'll judge you accordingly. So yeah, like I'm basically moaning, David. I'm moaning about.
I'm moaning, but I know. I mean, I feel similarly. Like this is something that has surprised me is how many people, particularly, and I know you shouldn't read the comments on YouTube, but I do read the comments sometimes on YouTube, how many people can't pass the difference between criticism and free speech, that by criticizing someone, they think that you're trying to shut them down. Like,
yes.
They sort of willfully kind of merge those two things.
Yes.
And also, like, the thing that really frustrates me is right-wing snowflakes. Like the people who are clearly really triggered in the comments and will probably be going on and on about how left-wingers are snowflakes. It's like, look, everyone's a snowflake. Everyone gets triggered, and those are the people that you probably see the most from in the comments threads.
Yeah.
And that has surprised me. It was something that I covered a little bit in my conversation with Chris Williamson. I'd like to see whether you are open to kind of shifting your position on things as well, because I think, I mean, this is one of the questions that I had, the one that I was going to go next to, because when we spoke in the summer, your argument was really that you're quite a small podcast, you're not really kind of on the same level as a lot of these people you're criticizing. I don't think that's true anymore, because I think your numbers are not far away from ours in terms of like the average kind of views that we seem to get. And you do have a highly influential viewership. I know you do. A lot of the people that listen to your podcast are players in this space. As I said, it's kind of a guilty pleasure. And I think you have made a kind of transition from just commenting on to being part of the same dynamics that you're critiquing. Which I think your interview recently with Chris Williamson made clear, where Chris kind of reflected as a small podcaster the influence that being featured on your show in what I think you'd agree was a little bit of a kind of sarcastic and dismissive way could potentially have on him. So my first question is, do you feel that you have a new set of responsibilities now?
So I do think that as your audience grows, that you do gain responsibility, and you have to consider the relevant dynamics. There's a difference between featuring somebody that has like 5,000 followers when you're a small podcast that like maybe 1,000 people listen to a month, versus if you're a podcast where 120,000 people listen a month, right? Because Owen Jones, a British journalist that we're both familiar with, has a large amount of followers.
Are you blocked by him?
No, but I haven't. I don't think I've.
I am.
Yeah, congratulations. I don't think that's a negative, but I use him because he's somebody that's rather famously not been shy about like quote retweeting smaller accounts or pointing his audience towards people he disagrees with, and inevitably he knows what will happen when he does that. And there's plenty of accounts that do it all over the political spectrum. He's just a notable example that springs to mind. So I definitely don't want to do that. Like, that's one thing. And I think in general we take steps to do that, nor do we have the kind of audience I think that would like harass people. But if we saw signs of that, we definitely would like call it out and mention it on the podcast. But even setting that aside, right, the like kind of sicking your audience on people, I think Chris Williamson raised good points that in some respect there were parts that we hadn't focused on, like in particular our potential ability to close down avenues for people to interview or speak to certain people, because we just genuinely hadn't considered that we would have that kind of influence. I'm still skeptical that many of the people that he mentioned, like Robert Wright, would be influenced by us in that regard. But I think that the point stands that we could have an impact on how people are perceived, right? If we cover them quite negatively and then someone else interacts with them. Like, I would have a reaction if a podcast I respected covered someone very negatively and then they reached out to me. It's just normal human dynamics. So I think it was good he brought those kind of points up, and that we should think about them more. And I have been pretty much like we did think about them a bit before, but definitely thought about them more with Chris after Chris brought them up. But I also think that what we do on the podcast is quite clearly offer a critical opinion on something. We don't argue that it's the only valid opinion that people could have, and we're quite open about the fact that this is like our assessment based on our backgrounds and our all of the influences that people mention, our political positioning and so on.
Isn't that a little bit like Joe Rogan's disclaimer of "I'm just a meathead, don't listen to me"?
Well, yeah, except we're not claiming to be meatheads.
Why are you taking advice from me, vaccine advice from me, or whatever? So it is, but like strategic disclaimers are useful for a reason. Like, there's a reason people use them, but and we use them in a manner that like everybody does. But I think the thing which sort of distinguishes the more negative variety of strategic disclaimer from a genuine disclaimer is whether you mean it and whether it actually like impacts on the way that you would cover something, or that you would give space to feedback and that kind of thing. And I think when Matt and I are offering our opinion, we are increasingly aware of the power to influence audiences and to, like kind of put ideas into people's reading of things, right? Because we are well aware that in a lot of cases, the people will not consume the original content, right? Our audience will not go and listen to 6 hours of Joe Rogan. Some of them will, but some of them will only consume it through us. And in that respect, we do take pains to make sure that we're not just
like kind of misrepresenting what people do and selecting the worst possible, one segment that they did something bad. And I'm not saying we're above selecting funny examples or, making fun of something which was an unfortunate metaphor or something that people used. We are, but when we flag that up, we are careful to say this is a kind of stupid point. It's just a funny thing. Like, it's not the main point of criticism. And people could do the exact same to us, right? Like, we have the same tics, the same issues. So I think we are aware of the dynamics, but there's a difference in like what our motivation and goals are, and becoming influential, like cultural commentators who've shaped the narrative is not on our list of things to do, right? Our kind of goals are much more mundane, and I think that helps because we're genuinely not setting out to like transform the world and become the most influential figures in the public intellectual world. We're just making a podcast to look critically at content using the expertise that we have. And we don't make any pretensions that we're doing anything different. So, people might read that as false modesty, but I swear to God, it's not. It's part of the reason that, like, I think a lot of people can misinterpret me or Matt, like, in their criticisms, because they do imagine us as these kind of clout chasing, power hungry people who want to replace the gurus and take their mantle for ourselves. And we're both very content in academia.
And I wouldn't say that you're trying to replace the gurus. I do think, and I'll come to this in a second, I do think that you are, by definition, just because you're operating online and you're operating with a podcast, you're operating with audience dynamics, that you are by definition subject to a lot of the same forces that you're criticizing the people that you're featuring. So I'd want to start by saying, what do you think your blind spots are?
Well, I'll answer the question about blind spots, but one thing to note is that we are always very careful to say that, like, the online environment is what it is, and like parasociality is a thing, right, which nobody can escape. Us nor you nor the people in the audience of both our audiences. But it doesn't have to be exploitative and negative, right? There's lots of online communities, and I mean, your goal here, right, is to construct one which is beneficial to people. So I don't think it's a given, and it sometimes is taken as a given, that like simply the act of creating a podcast or of creating an online community means that you're subject to creating, a quasi cult of personality. And I don't think it has to be that. There's plenty of like, fairly healthy communities around shared topics of interest. So I know that you would agree given your endeavor, but I just want to flag that up. And now, in terms of blind spots that we have, so there's tons that I can think of. I would say, like, Matt and I come from like politically similar perspectives, right? We're kind of center left people, and we tend to be very much politically on the same page. And because of that, we would also tend, and because of the academic background, we would tend to, like, I think, have less of a concern about some of the overwrought stuff concerning, like, what we would, even that framing, I would see it as overwrought a lot of the concerns around academia and that kind of thing, right? And I think that actually Matt and I are not fans of like wokeism as or the excesses that get attributed to that, but I think that because of our left-wing lean, we're generally more concerned about the excesses on the right, and that can introduce blind spots when dealing with people on the left. It can also mean that we are a little mean when it comes towards the far left, or, you know, we're obviously going to be mean to people on the far right, but we're, I think, also like fairly readily criticizing of people that are far to the left because we don't share their revolutionary politics. So and we definitely like step carefully when it comes to culture war topics, because primarily just because we don't want to be a culture war podcast. And I don't think my opinion on the trans debate or on racial dynamics in America are something that really many people need to hear about. But I also realize that that's a decision which is also self-serving, because I just don't want the hassle of dealing with that. So other people talk about those topics and inevitably get in the hassle. So if we are taking the positions that we are, it means that there's less of like a professional risk or that kind of thing. So those are some examples. And I like most people, I would tend to think that like a lot of them are justified because of like the greater threat that I would see from in the modern political environment. The far right is a lot more in control than the far left. Maybe not true a time ago, but like, you know, I'm talking about in the UK, you have Keir Starmer. In the US, you have Joe Biden, whereas on the right, you have Boris Johnson and the kind of Brexiteers plus Donald Trump and co. And then you have, all of the right-wing populists that popped up. Now, they're getting beaten. There are left-wing dictators and populists as well. But I think there was definitely a wave there of right-wing populism that was very concerning. So it's, I kind of think it's legitimate to be worried about Steve Bannon and Orban and so on, not just the communist or socialist regimes in Latin America and what they're up to. So, I don't know. I guess you could also I think you think that we have an institutional bias, right, towards existing institutions and towards the mainstream narratives. And my response to that would be that I think that's legitimate. We do have a bias leaning there, but it's not the uncritical bias that a lot of people assume. Like, I'm completely on board with Ben Goldacre and Stuart Ritchie and the open science movement. I have a completely cynical view of politicians, right? I don't think that political parties are all out for, the thing is that my worldview is actually pretty cynical, that I expect institutions to make mistakes. I expect for people to make like wrong decisions and for like evidence to be not communicated within scientific bodies and to take time, public health messaging to be confused. But these are all things that I factor in as like, that's the default, that's the baseline. There is never an institution that functions perfectly. There is never a political organization which I'll completely be happy and content with the way what politicians are doing and their priorities. And I feel that the heterodox sphere, like in some sense, they're slightly utopian because they present it as if we could get there if we recreated the institutions and we wiped it all away, that we could get to like this much better world. And I think, no, the world is always going to be imperfect and crappy, and we can reform things. We can improve the scientific process. We can improve journalism. But you'll never get to that utopia. So my institutional bias is just leaning towards that. On average, like if you followed the CDC and the WHO recommendations since the beginning of the pandemic, the primary activities that they emphasized were stay socially distanced, wear a mask for the vast majority of the pandemic, get vaccinated. Those three things, if you followed them, you're doing pretty decent. Whereas on the heterodox side, you have a scorecard which is more concerning, including like don't get vaccinated, and depending how far you go into the heterodox sphere, don't socially distance, don't be masks don't work or they do work. Like the position is always very fluctuating, and yeah, I think on average, that's why I lean towards like institutions and scientific consensus, because on average it is correct, more than betting on heterodox. But I don't think you should silence heterodox. I don't think heterodox opinions are always wrong. I just think that the default should not be that they are right because they're opposing the establishment.
There's obviously a few people that you've been particularly critical of on your podcast, and I wonder whether I'd love to hear you do an episode steel manning some of those people,
like the Weinsteins
or Jordan Peterson.
I think I could do a better job than most critics could, but I will say that you asked about like changes and biases and those kind of things. Now, we'll say one thing that both Matt and I have noticed is that whereas when we started, we might have had a very not very charitable, that's the wrong way to put it, but we would have had more charity that we were willing to extend to Eric and Brett. That lessens the more that you deal with their content and you find what they're doing harmful. It becomes harder, right, to extend the charity if you think they're actively like bad agents out or like misinforming, and it's kind of hard to not become like more cynical over time when dealing with people's content and find it harder to extend charity. So like that definitely comes in. But yeah, we definitely could and maybe should attempt to like steelman the positions of some of the people that we're covering in more depth, just to like even to just show that we can, because I think we can, but sometimes you don't want to.
I guess just sort of close off from my perspective. I think where that question is coming from is my primary focus, and has been for quite a while, is the kind of what Daniel Schmachtenberger or Tristan Harris might call the information commons, like the fragmentation of the information commons. And my general frame is that there are all of these institutional problems with journalism that I think are increasing and getting worse, like the substackization of journalism, I think, is another kind of destructive force on it. You've got all of these audience dynamics. But fundamentally, I think the parable of the IDW is that creating an alternative sense-making network based on personalities, you have a new set of failure conditions. And those failure conditions are usually psychological, personality-based, because that's the nature of the information ecosystem we've created, is that it works on our flaws. It feeds our narcissism, it feeds our confirmation bias, all of these different factors that obviously were covered in the social dilemma, and Tristan Harris has talked a lot about. So those are the failure conditions, and therefore I don't know what the answers are, but I think the answers have to be some more of these conversations across divides. I know Sam Harris is now sort of a little bit more questioning whether those actually achieve anything, but I feel that they can. I'm kind of going on Peter Lindbergh's kind of framework of like the mimetic tribes, who are the kind of mediators between those mimetic tribes. And the reason why I'm wanted to have this conversation with you is I do, from our interactions so far, I do believe that you're acting as well as you can in good faith, as well as anyone can in good faith, given the restrictions on human psychology.
Given
and I want to kind of invite more people into that and ask what these conversations might look like, and how we might kind of how we might think in terms of the of the health of the information commons more generally, and all of these tribalizing forces that pull us into these different echo chambers, which I think are a kind of existential threat.
So maybe to finish off the I would say that, like, given my personality issues, I'm doing all right, but like it's a daily struggle. But I always have been and remain somebody who does think it's useful to talk across divides, and maybe partly because of the background growing up in Belfast. Right. But I would also caution that there really are divisions that exist within mimetic tribes or whatever, like political groups and stuff, that exist for legitimate reasons, and that are not. I think there's a danger from assuming that kind of it's always valuable to have, like dialogues where everybody comes together and kind of like everyone takes something beneficial away, because I think that's fine as long as, like you mentioned, and I hate that, kind of drag it to this, but like it's good faith and engagement and all that. And I think you brought this issue when you talked with Jordan Hall about the proprietarian. So I know you're aware of these dynamics, but like people use conversations and debates to advance agendas. And like there are legitimate points about having debates around certain topics and framing things as here's two sides and we'll get, truth a bit from both of them, can be misleading because the evidence is not always in the middle on specific issues. So I think that's just one thing, like I would caution, but not caution to the point of saying, like, don't talk to people and don't do that. And I think the very last thing I would say is, like, whatever you think about our endeavor and like the level of gossipiness that is you imagine attached to it, I would recommend that if anybody wanted to see the potential value in what we do, myself and Matt at Decoding the Gurus, they listen to the episode on McCulloch and Malone, where because we explicitly there attempted to kind of highlight red flags that we think people can detect from listening to the content and can apply more widely. And I think that is a good illustration of the approach that we would want to, emphasize more over just us taking pot shots and like making fun of people for being male models. Like that will happen because of our personalities, but I think it's a good episode that illustrates like what we're trying to do. So if anybody wanted to check, that is the episode that I would recommend.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. And that's one of the reasons I thought it was a good time to have this conversation, is because I think a lot of the stuff, particularly to do with Malone and McCulloch, and also the Rogan episodes, even though I found them difficult to listen to, I do have more hope for Rogan than I feel was present in some of your analysis. But I think you did track a lot of his trajectory pretty well, and I thought the McCulloch Malone red flags were set out pretty well as well. So I would, I'd advise people to listen to those. Also, the interview with Sam Harris, which happened, and the interview with Chris Williamson, which I thought was a really
don't listen to that at the start. Don't listen to the Sam Harris as the first episode. But, yeah.
If you enjoyed Sam Harris's conversation with Jordan Peterson, where they went round and round for 3 hours talking about truth, you'll love that episode.
Yeah. Just change the word truth to tribalism, and there you have it. Yeah. Cool.
Chris, this was a pleasure, and let's do it again sometime. And I'd say I'll let you get to sleep, as it's 3 o'clock in the morning there, but I know you probably aren't going to end up doing work for another 2 or 3 hours.
Unfortunately so, but And we will have you on Decoding the Gurus in the near future to have a similar conversation, but for our audience. So maybe some of those points Matt would like to respond to. So
am I a guru
plenty
in
of
your
sense to be
taxonomy?
made. Yeah, well, you were featured on, although that was Jordan Hall was the target, so you were kind of like in the Chris Williamson role, and I think we were generally like pretty kind, but also that's a good example because the criticisms that we raised in that episode, I think are the same criticisms I raised to you, and we've talked about before, so what they are. Like, I think that's the important thing. Be willing to say it to someone's face if you're going to say it on a podcast and release it to the world.
Awesome. Always a pleasure, Chris, and speak soon.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching all the way to the end. And if you'd like to join conversations like this, check out our digital campfire. You get access to a load of member-only films. You can watch live, ask questions, come to our book club, our wisdom gym sessions, and our regular monthly meetups where we share what's going on behind the scenes, and you can also connect with other Rebel Wisdom members. What's more, you can also get discounts on our courses like Sense Making 101. Check out the link below, and we'd love to see you soon.